In recent months and even weeks, practically everywhere, Trump has been throwing accusations at NATO, this paper tiger, as the American president calls it. Moreover, this discontent is so intense that people are increasingly saying that soon the United States might leave NATO altogether. And then Europe will be left alone against Putin's Russia. And this is often mentioned in the context of the prolonged war with Iran, a war that many now openly call Trump's downfall and the greatest geopolitical gamble the US has ever gotten itself into. And they got involved because of their leader's excessive pride and lack of foresight. So today, we'll break down what exactly Trump's complaints about NATO are all about, how accurate they are, in general an analysis of various scenarios of Trump's behavior and their possible consequences, if Trump can even be analyzed at all. We'll also discuss Ukraine's place and role in this complex Game of Thrones. My name is Simon, and this is MGSH TV. Let's go! Let's rewind a little. Everyone knows that Trump, to put it mildly, doesn't like NATO. This has been clear since his first presidential term. And in general, he has always treated all existing international organizations, unions, and alliances with extreme suspicion and even contempt. In his worldview, not only NATO but also the UN, WTO, and WHO often appear not as traditional instruments of collective security or progress, but as a burden for America, unnecessary and redundant. Mouths that constantly need to be fed from America's own table. He has a similar attitude toward the European Union, even though the United States isn't even a member. And that's all because Trump sees a united Europe as his geopolitical rival and trade competitor. That's why he prefers to deal with each European country individually rather than with all of Europe as a whole. Because that way it's easier to gain an advantage and impose his own will. Alright, let's skip the demagoguery and get back to NATO. Trump's main complaint about NATO has always been that the United States bears the main burden of maintaining the North Atlantic Alliance, while the other members simply free ride on America's financial resources and military power. Such accusations are indeed partly justified. Since the Cold War, it has been customary for the United States, as the undisputed leader of the Western world, to provide peace, security, and stability on the European front. This includes the deployment of American military bases in Europe, many of which have nuclear weapons and the means to deliver them. Therefore, when a country, such as Lithuania or Hungary, joined NATO, it was understood that it automatically came under the protection of the American nuclear umbrella. Because that's what Article 5 of the NATO Charter, also known as the Washington Treaty, states. Collective defense means that an attack on any NATO member automatically means an attack on all the others, including mighty America. For many years, European states actively took advantage of this privilege, gradually reducing their military spending more and more, thereby shifting the main burden of defense onto the United States, rather than relying on their own armed forces. And the money they saved was spent on numerous social projects, building a kind of paradise on Earth. Absolutely free healthcare, free education, extensive social support and protection, all of this is typical of almost all modern European countries. But for the United States, this still remains a real utopia, largely because a significant amount of money has gone and continues to go toward funding the military. And so, Trump decided to correct this outrageous injustice. In his view, he wanted to make Europe pay for American protection, and pay big. Moreover, back in 2014, against the backdrop of the annexation of Crimea and the start of the hybrid war in Donbass, NATO member countries agreed to allocate at least 2% of their own GDP to defense needs. But in reality, no one followed these requirements. Europe continued to freeload off the US for its security. After returning to the presidential office, Donald Fredovich demanded to raise the bar for military spending to 5%. This was a shock and a real blow below the belt for almost all European countries. After all, defense spending was mostly in the range of 2 to 2.5%. For example, this includes countries such as the United Kingdom, Germany, Italy, and France. However, Belgium, Spain, and Portugal, on the contrary, spend even less. And Iceland doesn't have its own army at all, so it doesn't really worry about it. And only Poland stands out against this general background with a figure of almost 4.5%. Such an unprecedented level of military spending for Europe is explained by the fact that, starting from 2022, the authorities in Poland have been purposefully and consistently preparing for potential aggression from Moscow. Just in case something bad happens to Warsaw, which is quite logical, since it would be next in line. But most European countries are not very eager to follow Poland's example, understanding that increasing military spending automatically means cutting social spending. And this, in turn, will inevitably lead to defeat in the upcoming elections. Well, that's the curse of electoral democracy, when a ruler's decisions have to match his level of popularity among the general public. This isn't Russia, where the brainwashed and deceived people, no matter how much the authorities take advantage of them, will still vote for the Orthodox Tsar. However, a certain compromise was reached in June 2025 at the NATO summit in The Hague. At that time, under the blatant pressure of the Trump administration, the NATO member countries were forced to sign the so-called Hague Investment Plan. They committed to increasing defense spending to 5% of GDP, but not immediately, only by the year 2035. That is, when maybe Trump won't be in the White House anymore, which means there will be a chance to roll everything back. At the same time, out of the required 5%, only 3.5% should go directly to military needs. The remaining 1.5% was allocated for updating critical infrastructure, as well as ensuring cybersecurity and economic resilience. It seemed like everything was settled. And everyone seemed to be satisfied, but at the same time, they still looked out for their own interests. But as they say, that didn't last long. The Iranian card. In one of my previous videos, I already discussed in detail how the tactical victory of the US in Iran turned against them and is now starting to look like a geopolitical defeat. Even worse than the wars in Vietnam and Afghanistan. Trump is neck deep in this Middle Eastern quagmire, and it's unlikely he'll be able to get out of it anytime soon while saving not only face, but the rest of his body as well. The Strait of Hormuz remains blocked, oil prices are soaring, and the world is on the brink of an unprecedented energy crisis. This topic needs its own video, but something else is more important right now. Realizing that his blitzkrieg had failed, Tehran did not fall to its knees, and the Ayatollah's regime is not about to be toppled. Humiliated, Trump, just like Putin in 2022, started making various chaotic moves and statements. That's why now his main goal is to find those who would agree to pull chestnuts out of the fire in the interests of the US. And when neither the Arabs nor the Kurds could be drawn into a war against Iran, the White House occupant remembered NATO, or rather, that supposedly the European members of the alliance are obligated to help Washington in this already drawn-out war. Obligated, if not to launch a ground invasion deep into Iran, then at least to unblock the Hormuz Strait on their own, thereby exposing themselves to strikes from Iranian missiles and drones. And since none of the European countries wanted to take part in this adventure, Trump unleashed a torrent of insults, curses, and accusations against them, with the central threat being the possibility of leaving NATO. Before we start discussing the realism of such threats, we should first examine the reasonableness and legality of such accusations. So, in Trump's view, NATO members should enter the war with Iran because the United States has entered it. However, first of all, NATO is a defensive alliance, not an aggressive one, and Iran, no matter how crazy its ruling regime may be, has not attacked the United States at all. That means Trump, in this case, cannot appeal to that very Article 5 which provides for collective defense. Moreover, in this war, if anyone is actually defending themselves, it's Iran. Secondly, everyone knows and loves Article 5 of the NATO Charter, but they completely forget about Article 4. It stipulates that NATO members, before taking any action, must first consult with each other. And now let's look at what we have in our case. The US did not consult or seek advice from anyone except Israel and started a war against Iran. The European NATO members had no idea about this military operation, but it turns out they have to answer for everyone. It's pure absurdity. And the third point is purely territorial. Article 6 clearly defines the territory where NATO's interests apply. It's exclusively North America. That is, the oceans and the territories adjacent to them. In fact, this is reflected in NATO's very name, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The Middle East clearly does not belong to the North Atlantic. Israel is not a member of NATO. Therefore, European countries have no obligations toward it, nor can they have any. So, all this talk from Trump has no legal or even logical basis whatsoever. Since the US got itself into a mess, why should the Europeans follow their example? And this accusation is nothing more than proof of Trump's weak position and the lack of any reasonable backup plan in case the main one fails. It all looked good on paper, but they forgot about the pitfalls. It's purely a legal matter. Well, now it's time to figure out whether Trump can actually withdraw the US from the North Atlantic Alliance, purely from a legal standpoint. First of all, let's turn to the NATO Charter. So, Article 13 states that any member does indeed have the right to leave the organization, but not earlier than a year after officially notifying the US government of its intention. What should be done if the US itself wants to leave, and who should they address this request to in that case? There is no answer here. Moreover, there have been no precedents of leaving NATO so far. Therefore, in practice, this mechanism has not been worked out. It's only pure theory. Until recently, NATO was constantly expanding, and leaving it was considered something of an absurdity. Yes, if someone writes in the comments about France during the time of de Gaulle, they left NATO's military structures, but not the alliance itself. And in 2009 it fully returned. However, in addition to the one-year transition period as a limiter, there is at least one more safeguard. It was created precisely in case Trump or someone like him decides to withdraw from NATO unilaterally, without coordinating his actions with anyone. Right before the start of the presidential campaign in December 2023, Congress passed an amendment as part of the National Defense Authorization Act, which directly prohibits the president from unilaterally withdrawing the country from NATO. Now, for the president to withdraw, either the approval of 2/3 of the Senate is required, or a special act of Congress supported by a simple majority, but in both chambers. This provision was introduced specifically to fill an existing legal gap. After all, the US Constitution clearly states that all international treaties signed by the President must go through a ratification process in the Senate. However, nothing is said about the procedure for termination. Previously, this allowed presidents to terminate certain treaties unilaterally, but now that's no longer the case. The irony was that the co-author of this law was the current Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, who at the time was a senator from Florida and is now part of Trump's inner circle. At the moment, there are 53 Republican senators in the Senate, while 67 are required. And the Democrats definitely won't vote to leave NATO, and it's not certain that all the Republicans will support another one of Trump's adventures either. And after the midterm elections to Congress, which will take place on November 3rd, Donald Frederick will apparently lose control over both chambers altogether, considering the extreme unpopularity of the war in Iran among both Democratic Party supporters and Republican isolationists. We have a separate video on our channel about the real extent of Congress's influence on US policy. I strongly recommend you watch it. So it can be stated unequivocally that at this point, from a formal legal standpoint, any president will not be able to simply withdraw the US from NATO. At least not without the approval of the overwhelming majority of the American political elite. And Trump is definitely not one of those leaders who can reach a reasonable compromise with their opponents. Just remember the longest government shutdown in history. Still, it is possible that he will try to challenge this law in the Supreme Court. The good thing is that cases there over the constitutionality of one legal act or another can drag on for years. And by the time this bureaucratic machine has been through every circle of hell, there may well be a new occupant in the White House. By the way, this is a realistic picture, considering the workload and bureaucracy of American courts. What can Trump actually do? Since the US is a presidential system, not a parliamentary one, the head of state still has very broad powers, even without having a majority in Congress. After all, the president can always veto any bill passed by both houses of Congress, thereby blocking any initiatives that originate in Congress. Therefore, objectively speaking, Trump can still create a lot of problems within NATO, even without formally leaving the alliance. And thus, in essence, significantly weaken the alliance from within, reducing its geopolitical power and influence around the world to zero. In that case, NATO could really gradually turn into an unnecessary relic of the past, into an alliance that simply won't be able to, or maybe won't even want to, protect anyone. To be more specific, first and foremost, Trump could radically cut NATO funding. Today, the share of American funding fluctuates at around 60 to 70% of the total sum of all budgets. And no European country will be able to compensate for such a change in the amount, even if they all chip in together. At least, definitely not in the coming decades. Trump could also completely end, or at the very least significantly reduce, the American military presence in Europe. Let me remind the viewers specifically that American troops have been stationed in Europe for more than 80 years now, ever since the Normandy landings. As of now, US military bases are located in 11 European countries. The total number of American military personnel is about 75,000 people. However, since the Cold War, the key role has been played by the troops stationed in Germany. The famous Ramstein Air Base remains the main command and logistics center for American troops in Europe. Moreover, American nuclear warheads and their delivery systems are deployed in Germany, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, and also in Turkey. This weapon was specifically brought by the United States to deter potential Soviet and now also Russian aggression. So you can only imagine what kind of celebration would start in the Kremlin if the Americans withdrew their troops or even just their nuclear arsenal from Europe. I think no further comments are necessary. And Trump, as the commander-in-chief, is quite capable of pulling off such a move. And Trump could also take another route. Without withdrawing anyone or anything, he could simply start ignoring the US obligations under that same Article 5. And then, in fact, there would be no collective defense. Whether this would occur is debatable. However, more and more experts are expressing serious concerns about whether the US would actually defend its NATO partners in the event of a hostile attack. The greatest threat in this regard is the potential cutting off of the Suwałki corridor by Russia, followed by the occupation of the Baltic states. In one of my previous videos, I already discussed this possibility, as well as the overall danger of the Suwałki corridor. Therefore, under unfavorable circumstances, the situation could be as follows. Putin cuts off the Suwałki corridor, captures Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, and issues an ultimatum like, well, Donald Fredovich, what are we going to do next? Fight for real or finally negotiate? But this time, on my terms. Knowing Trump, in such a situation he could easily waver and back down. In practice, this scenario would mean the end of NATO. If not de jure, then de facto. So formally, without leaving NATO, the US could very well freeze its participation in the alliance. They could cut off financial support and even bail out at a critical moment. In the latter case, everything will depend on the specific circumstances and the political will of the leader. As you can see for yourself, so to speak, it's not exactly strong. What does Trump really want? Let's look more closely and analyze if freezing US participation in NATO is actually beneficial. And at first glance, the question seems almost rhetorical, especially considering the level of isolation, especially the low morale among Trump's circle and the desire to reduce any American spending abroad. But upon closer examination, a much more complicated picture emerges. First, we need to understand what place Europe, and specifically the European Union, occupies in Donald Fredovich's worldview. And he has repeatedly and ambiguously made it clear that he sees Europe not as an equal partner, but as a sort of semi-colony, a market for American goods, and at the same time an obedient satellite that should faithfully follow the instructions of its big brother in Washington. Just remember all those tariff wars, how much it bothered Trump that Europe sells more goods to the States than it buys. But within this strategy, the US leaving NATO, or even freezing its participation, is not at all beneficial for Trump. On the contrary, in that case, Europe needs to be tied even more closely to America, and in this context, NATO serves as a fairly simple yet effective tool. The US continues to provide security for Europe, and in return, it gets broad access to the European market. Naturally, if the US leaves NATO, it will immediately lose this leverage. Otherwise, Americans can hardly influence Europeans. In other words, Trump's statement about leaving NATO is really blackmail. However, it's not so much to change Europe's position on the Iran issue, but rather to force Europe to follow all the instructions from Washington and the US president personally. But the Europeans don't want to follow Trump's new course, and mainly, it's not even because they want to pursue an independent geopolitical line. After all, since World War II, Europe has almost always followed the course set by Washington. The main problem, first of all, is economic. Since the implementation of Trump's concept will inevitably lead to the financial exhaustion of Europe, a reduction in social benefits, a decline in the standard of living, and consequently, to serious socio-political upheavals. And the second reason is ideological. It is about the confrontation within the West between the right-wing and ultra-right forces led by Trump and the left liberal and globalist circles that govern most European countries. And the current American administration hardly hides its desire to remove these leftists and globalists from power. It's no coincidence that so much effort was made to ensure that Viktor Orban, the most prominent representative of European Trumpists, stayed in the war. That's why for the European elites, Trump's strategic line is disastrous, and they resist it with all their might. Moreover, despite statements by Macron, Merz, and Starmer about the need to prepare for defense without US involvement, many in the European elites still see Trump's accusations as a bluff and do not believe in a real US withdrawal from the alliance. But what if? So, to sum up, let's play a little game. The game is called What If? What if the US really did leave NATO? How would this fact affect Ukraine and Europe as a whole, even if only hypothetically? Strangely enough, this would have little effect on events in Ukraine, especially in the short term. Ukraine is not a member of NATO, and no one is planning to accept it in the foreseeable future. After Trump came to power, the US has hardly been helping at all, except for providing satellite intelligence data and selling weapons through the PRL program with European money. Therefore, even a reduction of this meager participation or non-participation of the US in NATO will not affect anything. Only the personal position of the American president and his strategists, and the shortage of ammunition against the backdrop of the war in Iran will not go away anyway. Of course, in the long term, this will have certain negative consequences for Ukraine because without the US, the alliance itself loses all meaning. And accordingly, even the hypothetical possibility of obtaining a long-term security guarantee disappears. But the impact on the events of the current Russian-Ukrainian war will definitely be minimal. After all, Putin started the attack not because of NATO expansion, but solely because of great imperial revanchist attitudes. I also have a lot of analysis on this topic on my channel, but for Europe, the withdrawal or even the suspension of US participation in NATO would mean unprecedented geopolitical changes. Compare it to the collapse of the USSR or the Great French Revolution. After all, in that case, European states would essentially be forced to move from the familiar system of collective security to a balance of power system, which was typical before World War II. This is a system where everyone is on their own, so forming new military political alliances is necessary, especially with an aggressive regime in Russia. To form a kind of European equivalent of NATO, or even Entente 2.0 the Entente, 100 years later. With the mandatory participation of the United Kingdom and France, which both have their own, albeit small, nuclear arsenals, and also Germany, which remains the economic hegemon of Europe. Under such conditions, European countries will have to forget about their beloved welfare state model for many years and increase defense spending several-fold. And in that case, the much-praised 5% of GDP won't be enough. It will be necessary to invest enormous resources in creating their own satellite network, their own air defense systems, their own strategic aviation, and a large number of missile and drone systems. In addition to trillions of euros, it will take years, if not decades, to create them. And again, without the United States, Europe will inevitably face internal division. A struggle for leadership will begin between the so-called Old Europe, that is, France, Germany, Italy, and the New Europe, meaning the countries of Eastern and Central Europe, who are more used to looking to the United States than to their Western European neighbors. It's unclear what position the United Kingdom, which has long-standing ties with America, will take in this case. However, as strange as it may sound, even such a situation brings considerable benefits to Ukraine, since without the US, Ukraine's weight and influence in Europe would significantly increase. The experience of the current war makes it truly an indispensable partner for European defense. Without Ukraine and its battle-hardened army, any European equivalent of NATO would be unviable from the very start. However, let me repeat once again, this is just a hypothetical scenario, not entirely impossible, but definitely highly unlikely. However, today, Europe must prepare for difficult times in order to become stronger and more independent, and it shouldn't rely too much on the generosity of good old Uncle Sam. And as for Ukraine, there's really nothing to discuss here. Its armed forces are the only real guarantee of its survival. No one is definitely going to fight in its place. The experience of the last 4 years proves exactly that. So once we make it through this, we can debate all we want. But just not now. It's time. That's all from me. Thanks to everyone for watching. Thanks to the sponsors for supporting the channel. See you next episode. Bye everyone.
Пока.